a critical component to mind control.
Being made over to be clones of the person who's at the top of the pyramid.
Interested in this subject because of my own cult involvement. I was recruited in 1974 into a front group of the Moonies.
The purpose of this particular video is I just wanted to outline what's wrong with forcible deprogramming. It's traumatizing, and it became illegal. Hi, I'm Dr. Steve Hassan, wanting to share with you a bit of my history and the history of deprogramming. As many of you know, the term was coined by Ted Patrick a long time ago. He wrote a book called Let My People Go, I believe. And Ted was a man whose family member got involved with a cult group. He knew some Bible, and he had a very confrontational, streetwise approach to getting the person out.
Good. Then why don't you get into the back of my van and I'll drive you home?
Ted later in the 70s did a lot of cases using the former members he rescued to do the heavy lifting. And my understanding is that the cults made him into such a huge boogeyman in cult members' minds, including mine when I was in the Moonies in 1974, 5, and 6, that when people met Ted Patrick in person, they expected a 6'8", 350-pound monster, and he was the short, pudgy guy with a speech impediment with not a high degree of education, and was pretty soft-spoken. So the fear that was put in members' minds of how horrible he was and how violent he was, when they met him, it was so discordant with what they were told in the cult that dissonance often served a purpose of getting people to question what the group had told them. And he didn't beat people, he didn't torture people, but he was involved with abductions, often hiring people, picking a cult member up on the street, throwing them into a van, whisking them off to some undisclosed location, and then basically putting security guards by the door and telling them that they're in a cult, telling them what was wrong with the leader, showing them how the leader, if it was a Bible cult, was misusing the Bible, etc. And my understanding is that another thing that made it so effective was that people were out of the cult environment and the constant reindoctrination of the cult, and brought to this other location where they were treated nicely, meeting former members of that group or other groups. It worked a lot of the time. And that said, I can report that there, as a person who was deprogrammed myself, because of the indoctrination, because of the phobia programming in my mind, the level of fear and trauma that was activated when my father showed up at my sister's house and took my crutches and put it at the other end of the room made me freak out. This kind of trauma of feeling like you're being held against your will is huge. And people have reported over the decades how, on the one hand, they're grateful to Ted Patrick and their parents for rescuing them from the cult, but also shared how traumatized they were from the experience, and how many times people reported that they felt more trauma from the deprogramming than they felt from being in the cult itself. So I wanted people to understand that back in the 70s, nobody knew anything else to do when an individual got swept up in an authoritarian cult and disappeared, changed their name, changed their clothing, and were estranged from family and friends. And so for many parents like my own, they felt like they had no choice but to try to do this type of confrontational, forceful approach. In my case, because I had nearly died in a van crash, was in the hospital for 2 weeks away from the cult, and because my sister Theo was the only person in my family and friends that didn't say I was in a cult and didn't say I was brainwashed, my sister only said, "I miss you, and I don't understand, and I want you in my life." At the point that I was in the hospital, in pain, needing surgery, etc., that was the person I called. And she persuaded me to come visit her. She said I had a nephew that I hadn't met yet, and how she wanted him to know his Uncle Stevie, which my sister called me when I was little, Stevie. And so I made my sister promise not to tell my parents or my eldest sister Steph, because I knew that they were critical of the Moonies and thought Moon was a cult leader, which he was. And so there I was at my sister's house on the sofa, and my father shows up, and my sister had promised not to tell my parents, and then my father showed up. So I felt so betrayed and so angry, and the ex-members kind of marched into my sister and brother-in-law's living room in Long Island and started, announcing that they wanted to talk to me about my involvement with the Moon Unification Church. And I remember saying to them, "You don't have an appointment, so you need to leave." Just trying to talk them out of staying. It didn't work. They kept talking. I just was chanting in my head, crush Satan, glory to heaven, peace on earth, glory to heaven, peace on earth, true parents, true parents, true parents. So it was going nowhere fast. And because the Moonies had been suspicious, they did give me permission because I was a leader and I asked to visit my sister. The Moonies knew where my sister's house was. I gave them the address, and they told me to call in every few hours to make sure that I was okay. And once this was initiated, obviously I didn't call them, but the Moonies apparently were calling my sister's house asking to speak with me, and my sister and my dad were making excuses that I was out getting eyeglasses and all kinds of other excuses. But finally they realized the Moonies were coming to my sister's house with the police, and so they needed to get me out of my sister's house. And as this effort of ex-members were trying to wake me up by persuasion with facts, I switched from "you need an appointment" to talking with me to asking to see my mother, because only my dad was there. And I always had a very close relationship with my mom, and I thought I could talk my mom into releasing me. Also, I knew that the Moonies, from other failed deprogrammings, the likelihood would be very high that I would be made to sue my parents, bring them to court, and I didn't want that. So I was asking to meet with my mom, and at the point that my dad realized the Moonies were on their way with the police, he said, "Okay, let's get in the car and go see your mom," and gave me back my crutches. And I walked out on my crutches to the back seat of the car. And we're driving on the Long Island Expressway towards the city, and we passed the exit for Utopia Parkway, which is where we should have gotten off if we were going to my parents' house. And I realized my father had lied, that we weren't going to see my mother. And then I started thinking that I need to kill my father. and that I could just reach up behind him around his neck and snap it. And I had been so trained that it would be better to die or kill than leave the group or betray the Messiah, that I actually entertained that thought for what felt like many minutes. But fortunately, my mind said to me, but you'll never leave, Father. You know the divine principle. God is with you. This is just a test. No need to kill your father. Everyone else would die in the car. Other people on Long Island Expressway might die. So I talked myself out of that strategy. And then we got to the new location where my father had prepared for the deprogramming to continue. And I'm sitting in the back seat. The two ex-members had left. My dad was turned around, looking at me. And I see this football, linebacker type person walking towards me. And I understood that they were going to try to move me into this other location. And I said to my father, he's not going to force me to go there. And I just want you to know that I'm prepared to kill him, kill you, and die rather than go. And I said it very forcefully, very much believing it. And my father started to cry. And he said, how would you feel if it was your son, your only son, who met a controversial group, dropped out of college, and disappeared from your life? And it was the force of his tears that made me stop and step into his shoes and imagine, what would I do if it was my son? And I started thinking, oh, but my dad has been programmed by the communist media. He really is worried about me. I know I'm not in a cult. I know I'm not brainwashed. And so I said to him, I'd probably do what you're doing right now, Dad. And I said, what do you want me to do? And he said, your mother and I just want you to hear another side of the story. We would like you to listen to the people, the ex-members, and think about what they're saying to you. And if you want to go back after a few days, I'll drive you there myself. But at least your mother and I will be able to sleep at night knowing we did the responsible thing. So I thought about it, and I wanted to prove to my family I wasn't in a cult and I wasn't brainwashed. And I think my dad said, stay for 4 more days or stay for 5 days. And then if you want to go back to the group, you can go. So we made a deal. I promised not to run away. I promised not to try to call the police, and that I would listen. So then I voluntarily, with my crutches, walked into the new location where the deprogramming could continue. But why I'm going into this detail is because I really don't think it would have worked if they had tried to continue forcing me, to listen. I think I would have just kept chanting and just being violent. But because my father's tear, I felt the real me was like, he really cares about me. He truly is worried. And I was so indoctrinated, I was convinced I wasn't in a cult and brainwashed. So what I'm trying to convey to you is that for me, at that moment, it became voluntary. It was no longer involuntary. And because it was voluntary, the trauma that I had been experiencing earlier that day of being, my crutches being taken away and all of that, dissipated dramatically. And in fact, the deprogramming continued for a number of days. And another time, I'll go into that story again in more detail. Turned out that by the final day, I had my moment of awakening following learning about Robert J. Lifton's 8 criteria of brainwashing in China in his book Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. I still have the copy that was used in my deprogramming 49 years ago. And we went through the 8 criteria that he wrote about in 61, and the Moonies were doing all of them, which was a point of confusion for me, because as a Moonie, the communists were Satan, we were God, and yet we were using the same techniques, and that did not compute. But that wasn't enough to get me out. What got me out was the following day, the ex-members gave me one of Moon's propaganda pamphlets where Moon was talking to congressmen and senators, saying how surprised he was that any American could imagine that a Korean could brainwash an American, and how much he respected Americans. And I had the first critical thought in 2.5 years, because I had been with Moon in person maybe 100 times, and he talked down about Americans and said the Koreans were the master race, and he even said that our brains were dirty and he needed to heavenly brainwash us, in fact. But the critical thing was, I had a thought, what a liar, what a snake. And once I allowed that negative thought to enter my brain, then I started thinking, well, then he can't be the Messiah, because we believe in a God of truth. I was a lecturer and a recruiter, and that's what the Moonies taught. God is a God of truth. And then I started thinking, that means he's not trustworthy. And as soon as I had that chain of critical thinking, it was like a balloon popping. It was like a house of cards going pop, 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 pop. And I felt like I was at the top of the Empire State Building or some skyscraper, and I was just falling. I didn't know where I was going to land, but like I had been an elitist, part of the chosen one that was going to save the earth. And I didn't know what to believe. I didn't understand. But that began my process of starting to sort out and understand brainwashing and mind control. So there's much more of my story. I've written about it in Chapter 2 of Combating Cult Mind Control. When I first got out of the group, for the first few months, I didn't want to talk to anybody. I needed another operation. But I started getting contacted by parents whose kids were in the Moonies, people that I knew in the Moonies, and I felt a tremendous sense of guilt over the people that I recruited into the group. So I started to agree to do interventions with Moonies, and I did that for less than a year. And my memory is that I did 12 cases, 10 of which were successful. 2 people wound up going back to the cult. Some of those cases were legal conservatorship cases, which involved the parents going with a lawyer before a judge, arguing, Your Honor, my adult son or daughter is a victim of artful and designing people. We believe he's been brainwashed into a cult, and we would like you to grant us custody for 1 week so we can provide help and information to our loved one. And judges were granting these conservatorships, and they were effective because the parents would go with a sheriff, knock on the Moonies' door, show the warrant for the person, and escort the person out, showing the paperwork from the court. And so they were legal in the sense that it was with the court's permission. And I did a number of those cases. I also did a few cases that didn't have conservatorships. So, but I want to be very clear. I was doing this because I felt guilty for all the people I had recruited into the cult. I felt as a former leader of the cult, I had knowledge that people didn't have. And I never did anything forceful. I never kidnapped anybody. I never would allow anybody to be mean or physical at all in any of the cases that I did. And at the point that the courts were lobbied by the ACLU and cults, going to religious groups saying, if you don't support us against deprogramming, they're going to start deprogramming your members. So courts stopped granting 1-week conservatorships. And at that point, I stopped doing it. And not only did I stop doing it, but I started speaking out against forced deprogramming. And I started doing only voluntary exit counselings. And I do remember back when the Cult Awareness Network existed, which was the precursor to the only group that's around these days is something called ICSA, the International Cultic Studies Association, which was actually founded as the American Family Foundation by a parent of a daughter who got into the Moonies, in fact. But my point is, with the Cult Awareness Network, a number of the activists around the country were pro-deprogramming because people like me got out because of deprogramming. But at the point it became illegal, I just started speaking out against forcible abductions and against forcible deprogrammings because it was traumatizing. And a number of people turned on me and thought I was a traitor because I was speaking out against it. And a number of people continued to do forcible intervention attempts, and they got in trouble with the law. They got arrested, and many of the people retired. I'm not aware of anyone doing forcible interventions anywhere in the world. I can't say that ever, because in Japan, with Moonies and other cult people, the culture is very different. Parents have a lot more rights in Japan, and they would sequester their loved one in their house or their apartment and bring in theologians or ministers to try to deprogram their loved one. And Dan Pfefferman, who was in the Moonies, said, "Steve, you said that you are against deprogramming. Would you write a letter to that effect that we can use in Japan?" And I thought long and hard about it, and I wrote a letter saying I'm against forcible deprogrammings and that it's traumatic and that it's better not to do that. So I'm going to look for a copy of that document. It's several decades old. But I still had a heart to want to help people who were trapped in cults. So we developed an exit counseling model, which was voluntary. People had to agree to meet with me and my team. I wrote Combating Cult Mind Control, the original one that came out in 1988, the book with 2 T's in combating. If you notice, the one over my shoulder has 1 T because I bought the rights back and I updated the book in 2014 and 15 and 18. But what happened when I wrote the book was that cult leaders bought the book and read the book, and they understood my methodology for doing exit counseling. People like Kip McKean of the Boston Church of Christ said to a meeting of 15,000 members of that cult that I was a wolf in sheep's clothing, and he marked me, and he marked my minister friend Buddy Martin, said that people would be in sin if they talked to me or read my book, etc. So the publication of the book actually got turned into a negative to a certain extent with the big cults anyway. But I was doing voluntaries for a really long time. I became a mental health professional. I developed more and more understanding about social psychology. In the 80s, I started studying about communication techniques. I was exposed to NLP, neuro-linguistic programming. And what happened in the 90s was when the digital world was created and websites, it changed the entire field of how to help a loved one. Because instead of me carrying 50 pounds of books and Xeroxes of articles and internal documents and speeches, things were being put online. And people didn't have to just go to the library and look up in the Dewey Decimal System books on cults, and my book was one of the original bestsellers on the topic of cults. When smartphones came into existence, especially when they had location trackers and people could use pagers and Blackberries, etc., I needed to evolve the approach into a way that would work. And I realized that as I was becoming more and more high profile, people could look me up online. If the parents said ahead of time, we want you to meet with somebody, who was his name? Stephen Hassan. They could look me up, and then they talk with the cult leader and they'd say, no way, you can't do that. So what evolved is what I eventually called the strategic interactive approach, which is described in Freedom of Mind book, the dark blue one that's over my shoulder. And what this approach is about is educating family, friends, ex-members, and coordinating them in a complex systems approach where I would be encouraging people to interact with the cult member directly and indirectly with the goal of empowering them to start questioning. And what helped me get out of the Moonies was learning about Chinese communist brainwashing. And after 1978, Jonestown happened. And we started having videotapes of TV shows about cults. So I had a little portable video player that I would take on cases. But the notion is that a cult member will be more likely to listen to family members, friends, neighbors, and such. And instead of trying to do a direct persuasion approach, it's sharing information, asking the person's opinion, just like my dad was asking me to step into his shoes. That's one of the techniques that work for me and that I teach clients. Because in my experience, nobody wants to be in a exploitative, controlling cult with a malignant narcissist leader. And because life is really hard in destructive cults. And it's very the opposite of love and freedom and creativity and choice.
I'm going to use fear to get them to do what I want.
Isn't that like terrorism?
No, it isn't like terrorism. It is terrorism.
So what I teach now is this methodology that requires outsiders, people outside the cult, to interact warmly with people in the organization, which is the opposite of any type of forceful deprogramming approach. So I encourage you to check out freedomofmind.com, check out my Substack, check out my podcast. I have courses online for clinicians as well as for family members and ex-members. And I'm encouraging people to start reaching out to their family and friends who've been radicalized politically or into conspiracy theories like QAnon, and at least start slowly developing a warm relationship, because contact with ex-people and contact with non-members in the outside world is vital for successful exit. So thank you very much, and stay tuned. Take care.